Welcome, restoration professionals, to Restoration Minutes, your source for industry information and education. Be sure to like and rate us if you enjoy the content we provide.
All right, welcome into another episode of Restoration Minutes. Today I have Brad Stevens with Vector Solutions. They are a unique outfit down in Huntsville, Alabama, that basically they are adjusters and consultants at the same time, which is something that a lot of us would probably love to deal with. So everybody welcome in Brad. Brad, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. My name is Brad Stevens. I'm the founder and CEO of Vector Solutions. As Mike said, we are a full-service adjusting firm, but on top of that, we are also a large loss consulting firm. And a little background. I've been in this industry for a long time. Found myself naturally gravitating to more of the large loss, the commercial large loss, commercial agribusiness. And I come from the contracting side. Prior to getting into adjusting, I was a contractor. I didn't do mitigation, but I did restoration. Worked with several mitigation partners, and also did a lot of restoration work that was just your typical everyday. I want an addition on the house or a commercial build out kind of stuff. But I gravitated to insurance through some, superintendents that were working for me and kind of introduced me into, didn't even know what an independent adjuster was when I had my construction business. But I was very familiar with doing some insurance work and working off exact-made estimates and kind of understood the process, but got into claims, and cut my teeth like any other independent adjuster, hustling claims for every adjusting firm that would give them to me. But after I'd been in the industry for about 10 years, I really realized that there was something missing. That the industry where it was headed, talent was not really being rewarded. A lot of adjusters, felt alienated from the industry itself because they were getting less pay. It didn't matter how much knowledge they had. And so that's really, why I started Vector. I started Vector, to kind of fill that void of finding the best of the best adjusters, paying them more, paying them faster, and really retaining, good talent in our industry. What that's morphed into is, our understanding from the contracting side, this disconnect between carriers and contractors. It's almost like we're in a battle with each other. And I found ourselves in a very unique position of being able to listen without speaking to both sides, and then having that conversation with both sides of, well, let me give you this perspective from the outside looking in, because I've been in your shoes and I've been in your shoes. And so, that's really where we got into the consulting space, and it's just understanding where those disconnects, whether it's miscommunication, overestimating scope issues, everything that you can throw out there that's created either distrust or a problem on a claim, trying to create a process that really removes that. And, that's really where we've found significant growth and significant direction is providing that service. And, what's really cool about that, as you know, Mike, is that, what we're seeing out there is, everyone that we're talking to, both on the contracting side and the carrier side, are just ecstatic because they both know the problems. It's just no one's ever come up with the solution. I mean, it's in our company name. That's our goal, is to provide a solution. So, that being said, that's Vector's really morphed into a very strategic growth period. And, we're really seeing significant growth on the, large loss and commercial, especially on the adjusting and consulting.
Yeah, so, this past year, obviously no storms, a lot of us, I just left the restoration world and about 8 months ago, and everybody's like, asking me if I was some kind of savant and knew that there wasn't going to be a storm this year. And I just think it was the luck of the draw. But it was like an El Nino year, so sometimes those are very mild. And but anyhow, so what is the biggest thing in your experience so far, with commercial losses that you think? And I've got something in my head already, but what do you see as the biggest disconnect between contractors that are in our space and the client, which is a commercial business?
I mean, funny thing is, to nail that down to one item is difficult. I think that it's a combination of a few things, but I think there's definitely some primaries that stick out. I think, first and foremost, it is from the contracting side, there is the carrier's not going to pay if I do it the right way. So I need to be high to get to the number that I want to be at or need to be at in most cases. And so there's this uncertainty from the contractor, and I'm going to use the same analogy for the other side. So the contractor says, I need to be at 100. So, I know they're going to beat me up. So I need to be at 130, 140, and I'll be fine at the end of the day when we get to 100. Now, the backside on that and the complaint from the contractor is, well, I can't ever get paid because we're spending 3 months after the job fighting, trying to get that, down to 100. So then you have, the carrier side that is in a position where every contractor that submits an estimate is high. And so, there's an immediate distrust. And when there's an immediate distrust, okay, well, this surely can't cost this much. Or, do we really need to do it this way? So,
I feel like in that aspect, as an industry, we have done that to ourselves. I mean, and it's both sides' faults. I mean, like you said, and so there's also some bad players on both sides. We'll
Yep.
go ahead and say that too. And so I definitely think there's some ways to fix. That's got to be fixed. That, and we'll do a shameless plug for our software later that I think helps fix some of that. But one of the biggest disconnects I've noticed, talking to contractors, and especially early on in my years when I was with some of the bigger franchise storm teams, is business interruption. How can we keep that company open or at least partially operational during this process? It's like contractors that miss the mark on that and are like rushing in, and we're going to shut you down for 3 weeks. We got to get this done and that done. They lose those jobs to the contractors that come in and try to help work with the client to stay open.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, there's 2 or 3 things that I would nail down. I would say that that's one of the 3 pillars. Understanding from the carrier side, the property is only one piece of the pie. And oftentimes, and really my third pillar that I'm going to bring into this, because I think we need to talk about them side by side. It's understanding those buckets, understanding what goes into what, and ensuring that you're working with the carrier client, the BC, the adjuster, the insured, whoever, to get those, that pie sliced correctly. But then understanding, what is my approach to this job that is the most effective? And when I say effective, the case in point is to get the insured back operational. What needs to be done? How can it be done? And what can we do that's alternative or thinking outside the box? So that third pillar that I mentioned is really execution on the job. I think a lot of times we're going to do it the same way we do every other job. We don't care if it lasts 6 weeks. That impacts that business income. That impacts, our number one goal for our firm, we talk about it all the time, is we don't want to see a closed sign on one of our insurers. We want to see an open sign. That open sign means different things for different people, whether it's a manufacturing loss, a habitational loss, there's a difference need there. There's a different urgency. And secondarily, back to that understanding the business income and, executing on a job, it also goes into, clear communication with the insured. Hey, I tell all of my insureds up front, right now you're at zero. We're going to take steps. That might be 50%. It might be 10%. It might be 80%. But we're clearly going to work together to understand these are the hurdles. These are where we're going to run into. We're going to run into delays. We're going to run into, holds, scheduled shutdowns, whatever it is. But oftentimes, what we see and what the biggest problem is from how that's executed is everyone overpromises and underdelivers instead of underpromising and overdelivering. And there's nothing worse than saying, hey, we're going to get this up and running in 3 weeks, and then 2 weeks into them you have to sit back down and say, oh well, you know what, we're wrong. It's going to be 6 to 8 weeks. No, that can't happen. And
now you have ruined the whole relationship right there.
And the analogy that I use with everyone, and it doesn't matter if it's the contracting or the carrier side, is it all goes back to the first domino. Like everyone, like you said, Mike, wants to rush in. There is a rush in aspect of a lot of losses, water extractions, board ups, like there are definitive needs
the true emergency service.
For the true emergency. But once we get past that emergency, a lot of times the entire project is literally make or break back to when I call the first domino, it's after that emergency. It's what is the plan? How are we going to do it? How are we going to execute? What's the time frame? What's the cost? And is everyone on board with that plan? And does that plan take everything into account that needs to be taken into account? Sometimes that's super easy. Sometimes it's super, super challenging. We've run into losses where they don't have enough business income, coverage. Okay, well, we understand they want to be up and running, but we can't pay extra. There's those hard discussions that you have to have. But 9 times out of 10, if it's presented correctly to the carrier wants to pay. I know that this is probably going to shock some people. But there's not a client that I could call that we have. I know there's some bad characters in the business on the carrier side, but there's not a client that we have that will honestly not say, we want to pay what we owe, and we want to do what we can to help the insured. That's what every carrier does.
And I've heard that a lot, and I have been all over the place in my tenure in this industry, and one of the things that I failed early on to realize is I was always anti-adjuster, anti-consultant. I was like, I knew as soon as they showed up that I was in for a battle, and sometimes you still are, but stakeholder theory is very important. And so those of you who hadn't looked into that before, read up on it. It's not complicated, but basically, if you want a job to go smoothly, you got to realize who all the stakeholders are, that you can try to talk to. So that's going to be the adjuster, the consultant, but obviously number one is your client. But, if everybody is happy, and sometimes within your client, you're going to have different levels. Like the maintenance guy is going against, he wants to get everything done and put back to shape, but your front office people want to be open, and so you're having to wrangle stakeholders within the company too. But the best way that you can do all that, and the better that you can do all that, the smoother your jobs are going to go, and the quicker you're going to get paid. It took me a while in my tenure to learn that. And like I said, there's a particular consulting company out there that's got a file on me. The first time they ran into me, it was not nice, and part of that was my fault. But everything I did, I communicated and validated. And so when they showed up the next storm with me, I said, hey, I know the game with you guys. What are you going to do? Where are you going to put your bean counters? And it was like, no, Mike, we got to file on you. You're good. You just send me a summary at the end of every day. And I was like, okay, that's the way to go right there, because I document everything. So, knowing who the stakeholders are and working within, reason. Now, if you feel like it's being done wrong, it's different, but
Of course.
the biggest problem that a company doesn't want to have is they do not want their customer, your client, they don't want their customer having to be turned away and find someone else because they may never come back. And you had a contractor that also uses our software that just did something that I thought was very cool. And I know we don't want to say a whole lot of names, but they set up a conveyor belt system within a warehouse to keep things cleaning so that the warehouse could keep running. I mean, it was amazing, the pictures I saw. You want to tell a little bit
Yeah,
about how it came into play?
and yeah, and that's just again where, back to the stakeholder question, in this job, the biggest difficulty that we had is there was a lot of stakeholders. This was a huge manufacturing facility, a lot of department heads, managers, executives, a lot of people, at the table. One of the things that really, I think, lays a project out for success is, first of all, ensuring who the stakeholders are, but then also having them bring in, some of the people underneath them. Like, hey, let's get everybody in the room. I know that 90% of the meetings are going to be with just the stakeholders. But once we've had those stakeholders meetings, let's make sure, everyone in the room understands the plan, and we're not hearing the feedback of, oh, this won't work, from the guy that has to do the job 2 weeks after he's supposed to have been doing the job. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of times that the stakeholders are the people who are making business decisions and money decisions, but sometimes they aren't the ones that actually have to do the work.
Yep.
So, keep that in mind when you're having those stakeholder meetings. Ensure that even if it's outside of your stakeholder meeting, figure out who actually, sometimes it's down to the janitor level, who actually has to do what's going to be implemented, and pick their brain. Hey, this is, I'm sure that this is what we're thinking about doing. What's your, do a SWOT analysis. What's the strengths? What's the weaknesses? What's the threats? But in this facility that we had, ultimately, if we shut down this facility, first and foremost, when it was shut down right out the gate to the fire, we were burning $250,000 to $500,000 a day in payroll. But obviously, anybody would look at that and look at it from you're just trying to save the carrier money. No, these are people's jobs. Yep. Like, if these people don't get back to work, they're going to quit, and the insured is going to have long-term problems. But secondarily, any other mitigation company would have come in and said, nope, this product's messed up, got to be cleaned. And so, all that's going to happen is it's going to contaminate other stuff. So we're going to shut this whole place down until it's clean, and then you can turn back on. It wasn't an option. It wasn't an option no matter who the contractor was.
Yep.
And I should also preface, this is one of those where they're going into their peak season. Losses always happen at the worst time. It's never the easiest time. But that being said, we came up with an alternative way to basically chamber the entire area that needed to be cleaned so that we could control contamination coming in and out. But then product-wise, we set up within that a decontamination tunnel and chamber so that the product could still go through its normal workflow, no impact to the workflow, but then, staffing that tunnel with mitigation technicians to clean stuff product-wise and send it through the production process further down the line. And, immediately cut in all honesty, I want to say a 6-week shutdown. No matter how many people we threw at it, it probably was closer to an 8 to 10 week shutdown. And, we were able to get them fully operational within 7 days. Obviously there was still there's always those headaches and hiccups to work out and get it running smoothly. But really by day 10, it was like, the loss never happened from an actual production.
Yeah, like I talked and interviewed a subcontractor, and so some people may find the story of this job kind of familiar. We didn't say the client then either, but I interviewed a subcontractor a couple of months ago who was on that project, and he was like, it was such an amazing thing that he had employees coming up to him, and he's not even the prime contractor that was on the job. He was just a sub that was there to help do some stuff, and he had people coming up to him and thanking him for the fast response and that they could get back to work because they had kids to feed and so on and so forth. So that was one of the most amazing stories that, you always hear good stories, after storms and events or even individual losses. And so that one was a cool story. And then when I got the contractor to share some of the photos with me, it was a pretty cool setup inside that chamber. I was definitely impressed because I've been creative in my career, but that was a creative solution right there to a major problem.
Yeah, and that's really where, what we try to do. I don't know if honestly, it's probably, I have to give credit to my dad. I mean, my dad for a living would go into facilities and as a consultant and create efficiencies, all the way down from staffing to equipment to whatever it was the company was challenged with, especially in the manufacturing space. But I think I just kind of grew up around that. Okay, well, we don't always have to do it the same way. There are different ways, and obviously you have to take into consideration the impacts of doing things from an alternative way.
Since we're both from the South, I would say there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Yeah, there's more than one way to skin a cat. That's for sure. And ultimately, this goes back to what I was talking about of looking at the big picture. On paper, the contractor wants to go in and shut it down every time. They're going to make more money, because there's all that extra. Yeah, you get it done faster, or there's less equipment, less manpower, or whatever. But back to what you said should be primary. What is the priority here? The priority is to get the insured up and running.
Yeah, because the impact of financials is not just, like how much income they're losing that day, kind of a thing. And it's also, like you said, it's the mouths that to feed those kids, it's all those employees, their payroll. It's the customer, losing that customer for the next 10 years that business interruption don't cover and doesn't even know about, don't acknowledge, but you lose 10 clients. I had a friend of mine who did a factory fire down in Georgia. He just finished up right at the new year, this past year. And, they lost a client, during the initial week. And they think they'll never get them back. And that client was like $100 million a year client. But that client had to get a product out in the packaging that he needed, they didn't have because it caught on fire. And so they lost that client maybe forever. They may be able to get him back, but he had to go somewhere else. And if he went somewhere else, so now they've lost that income, but now they've lost all that future income from that client. Same thing with hotels. People that have a favorite resort or hotel, that they like to go to, and now they can't get in it. Well, now I'm still going on vacation, so now I got to book somewhere else. Well, if that other hotel impresses me, I may not ever go back to the one I thought I liked, And so that's the types of things we got to take into consideration. All right, Brad.
I always say reputation is not a coverage.
Yeah.
Like you said, we're covering the income, the extra expense.
Yep.
But what about the reputation? The other thing that I do think is a hard conversation to have, and it needs to be had more by contractors. I mean, obviously they're not. When I say it needs to be had more, I think we need to educate more.
Yep.
But I also think it's an area that the carriers need to really better understand and also work at communication. Like all parties is what I'm getting at. Need to communicate this better. Is that look, your business income is for the period of restoration. So once you're back up and running, it ends. Everybody needs to understand that up front. But that being said, it's so important to understand, this is why, one of our big priorities is understanding the period of restoration on every project. It gets skipped on, I was guilty of it for years, even when I was handling large loss stuff, because I was like, who really cares? Because I wasn't handling the business income. I wasn't the forensic accountant. But, as you get more into the, GA, EGA level adjusters and you start dealing with these huge, losses with huge business income exposures and extra expense exposures, those are things that have to be defined. What is the time period? But I think it's also important for, everyone involved to understand, like, what is that definition? Every policy is different. And a lot of times the policyholder doesn't get an in-depth understanding, or even the contractor, like, hey man, we've only got 30 days. There's different policies, different endorsements, different things that can impact losses. And, you can have two hotels side by side and have completely different, ways that the BI extra expense impacts the loss.
Yep.
And unfortunately that gets missed a lot of times until you're 30 days in, or, even further in some instances.
Yeah, I mean, it is shocking to me. Another thing I wanted to pick your brain about, Brad, is, I know that you guys, are a fan of our software, kind of a thing. So a shameless plug there for Helix Co. But, Helix Co aside, and even just contractors in general, even if they use what is some weak areas as far as documentation, or whether it's communication? What are some weak areas when you get that final bill on these massive projects, when we're talking $1 million or more? What is the thing that you find contractors are the most horrible at that they need to work on in general?
I think the biggest conversation that I have with everyone, and it goes back to those pillars of, okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to hash this out before you start. And when I say hash it out, like, we're going to in-depth hash this out, not just from a price list, staffing ratios, timelines, getting the scope nailed down. What is the method? What is the process? Do we need to test anything before we give you the green light? The biggest problem is that doesn't get handled on the front side, and everything hashed out. A lot of contractors have this urgency that, if I don't get started and I don't get people here, I'm going to lose the job. And don't get me wrong. Hear me when I say, I'm not saying that that's not important, but having 10 or 15 people there, working when we know we're scaling to 60 or 100, I don't have an issue with that. Where we have issues is there's 60 people showing up tomorrow and we don't even know where we're starting or what our process is going to be, but they're going to be there doing something and we're billing for it.
Bunch of guys standing around,
Because the last thing that, and again, I've had so many contractors, and I know, Mike, you could go to a ton of the people that we've worked together with that, I think you've got a new client signing up, just now that came out of, when we work with them and I know we're pulling the reins back and saying, hold on. But even this new client that you've got coming on, we just did a huge project with them, and, they cut their staffing by 30% before we gave the green light, because after we talked through everything, got the ROM built, got the method, the amount of people, that this is going to be the process. And when I say it took some time, we're talking 2 days, 3 days at the most. But, they were able to, from their original ROM to their updated after 3 days, they, carved off 2 weeks of production time and cut their staff by 30%-ish, I think, if I remember correctly. But my point is, the bigger picture of what was awesome is they, at the beginning of the project, told the insured that they were going to be shut down through mid-March, and they had them up and running by Valentine's Day. Now, it was 50%, not 100%. but they were at 100% by March 1st, which is still almost an entire month ahead of what would have happened if we just sat back and said, okay, great, do the job, and we'll fight you on the backside. And that is the biggest thing. And I know a lot of contractors are like, well, I sent the T&M sheets and they approved it, and I told them what I was going to do, and I communicated this and that. You can communicate all you want. You have to get agreement and buy-in and document it on the front side. And that creates accountability for everyone. And I can't tell you how many projects that I learned that lesson the hard way. There's been times where we didn't talk about this because I figured the contractor was not dumb enough to do something. And next thing you know, I'm getting a bill for it. And I'm like, what is, but what ground do I have to argue? I approved the T&M, or I approved, whatever. And I'm probably a little bit more forgiving when I make a mistake, but a lot of times the carrier's like, nope, we didn't ever agree to that. We never talked about it, and then they're going to fight, and then they're going to delay. Most delays that we see on the claim side is a 50% problem. 50% of the problem is what I just spoke about. The other 50% is, the carrier has just not gone through the process or clearly communicated like, hey, this is a big loss. It's got to go through a lot of levels before we can get payments rolling. But getting that wrong, getting that, everything stamped and approved before you start. And again, when I say before you start, before you get into the meat, before you get into the full blown, this is what we're going to do. And really, it's not just where the contractors fail, it's where the carrier fails as well. And it's where we try to do things different. A lot of times the carrier, they're there to shake hands and kiss babies and email me what you got, and they're gone. Yeah. And, the one thing that we do different is, we're going to be heavily involved until it's up and running smooth. Sometimes that's 2 days, sometimes it's 2 weeks. Every job's different, but making sure once the green light is given and monitoring that everything's going smoothly. I would say that's the other thing that the carrier fails at. It's, and again, back to it's both sides. Hey, if it's not running smoothly, let's have a meeting. Let's talk with the carrier, again, going back to the stakeholders, like, hey, this is not working. And we've had those. We've had those jobs where, every project is going to run into its hurdles. It's how you handle those hurdles. Again, back to the dominoes. You got a bunch of dominoes falling, and all of a sudden the road stops. A lot of people skip past why did it fall. They just want to go start the dominoes. Well, then the next one falls, and the next one falls, and the dominoes aren't falling properly. You have to go back and say, okay, what is the challenge, and how do we overcome it? And that's where, again, maybe the easiest road is to put the dominoes up and over the hill, but maybe the more cost effective is to go around the hill. You've got to have those conversations. And when you make changes, clearly communicate what it's going to impact. Hey, this is, this is still going to look like it's going on track time-wise, but you're going to see an increase in cost. Or, hey, the cost isn't going to change, but it's going to impact the timeline. Hey, it's going to impact everything. Clearly communicating those, again, to all stakeholders.
Yeah, regular meetings, I think, is a huge important thing that, we probably, in my career, and I don't want to say any specific company, but we implemented in my career probably 10, 12 years ago, really, we started getting better practices, and that was trying to establish daily meetings. And sometimes it's may only be like once every few days with each person, but I've also been on massive projects where I've had 3 or 4 meetings a day every day. I'm meeting with the maintenance staff in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'm meeting with the management staff or the front desk people. Then the afternoon I'm meeting with the owner or the owner's representative, kind of a thing. And the consultants are kind of thrown into that one usually. And, understanding the stakeholders that are involved is going to definitely help. And one of the things that all the contractors I know of that has worked with Vector has really noticed is how fast, if they do this communication and work with you guys on the front end, is how fast the money moves, And, I've bluntly, asked contractors over the years, like, if you could guarantee, that you're going to get paid, within a certain time frame, especially on large loss, how much is that worth to you? And most all of them that's worth 10%. But the problem is that it's very rarely happens. I've worked contractor I just left. I mean, just now in the last 3 months, closed up going all the way back to Hurricane Ian. So it is that is a lot to have to carry for a contractor. And so, but it's same like if those things would have been settled on the front end. Sometimes when you have that conversation on the front end, the contractor may say, find somebody else. That's fine. But sometimes the best job is the one you walk away from.
Oh, yeah. And ultimately the risk is, I have a clear understanding of the risk. I've been the contractor. I've been that person that, just like you said, I'm waiting to get paid a year later. And that's not what I expected going into that project. Or, had to chase money with lawyers and attorneys and spend half the money I'm going to get just chasing the money. That problem's never going to be completely solved. We're always going to have that problem in the industry. There's, I think that there are some positives in our industry that are happening that are helping that, be mitigated to some extent. But I think, back to where we, when I said at the beginning where we had this inherent trust issue, the biggest conversation that we've talked about some of the conversations we have with contractors, the sit down conversations we have with our carrier clients, they don't like to fight. And most of the time, the reason they're using a third party is because they don't even know what to fight about. They just think it's wrong. And, that's where really this whole BC industry is created. It's, in my mind, it's because, everyone's creating positions, but one side or the other does not have the ability to defend their position. Sometimes it's the contractor, they don't have the documentation. Sometimes it's the carrier, they don't know what they're talking about, so they're going to hire, a BC, or back to we've always done it this way.
Yep.
But, one of the biggest conversations that we have with our clients is, hey, if we get this agreed upon up front, are we going to have issues with payments on the back? And again, I can't speak for every carrier out there because, there are different ones, different processes, but 9 times out of 10, it's that's completely fine with us. And in most cases, we have very defined terms and timelines, and it's important for us to communicate that to the client. That one of the fire projects we got going right now, I explained to the contractor, hey, this is going to go all the way up to the VP level at this carrier because of the size project. The biggest challenge and wait period we will have is getting reserves set. Once the reserves are set,
Yep.
the money will flow. But give me, 10 days, whatever the time period was of like, this is what it's going to take. Are you fine with that? I've had the contractors come back and say, if I could get X, I'm fine with that. Okay, well then let me go back to my client and find it.
Yep.
I've had other clients, some big organizations, we're not worried about it. We can float it. It's not a big deal. But just having those conversations and getting those timelines and, going into our managed repair program that we've launched, that's one of the key pieces. I mean, we've got a project right now that literally it cracked me up when I saw the email because the client, the carrier is ready to make a payment and I have to go to the contractor and ask for an invoice. Like, that's a good problem. I was completely floored when I saw that email, but I was like, this is just case in point of, look, when we get it agreed to that this is how it's going to go, the money is not an issue. And like I said, again, that's not a blanket. We all know, we're on some participation program, write-in stuff where we've got 13 syndicates and getting money out of them is like pulling teeth.
Yep.
But again, I'm having that conversation, and this is where the carrier drops the ball a lot of times. you know, do I need to get banking info on day one and submit it to London because I know it's going to take London 2 weeks to get them put in the system.
Yeah, that's
But
one of the biggest problems I've had on bigger projects is, like you said, you end up with 12. I did a project, during Ian where I think we had 16 different syndicates that backed up this policy, and at different levels. You got three or four that
yep,
cover it up to 2 million, another group that covers it up to 8 million, so on and so forth. But this project got into, not just our part was at 20. But with all the grounds and landscaping stuff at this place, I would say it probably got 30 to 40. And the problem that was frustrating from us, and it still, I will say it went very smooth and fast considering the size of project it was. I mean, we walked off the job in December, it was paid in full by April. So that was crazy fast, in my experiences. But the problem that I had, and I was going to ask you, how this works on your end, is that first level group, they want to go through everything. They want to do their own audit. And then it's like as soon as they get done, they release their funds. Okay, so you get that partial payment. Now the next syndicate, they want to start from scratch. Is there any way to kind of like bring those guys together and say, like, listen, this job has already been audited. It's good to go. Review the numbers. There's nothing to argue with here. And I think our software actually helps with a lot of that with the geolocating and timestamps and things like that. But what's your opinion?
yeah, and at the short answer is yes. Obviously the biggest thing a lot of people from the contracting side need to be asking is, I know that you're not an expert in interpreting the policy, but understanding, is this a participation schedule and how that works? Because there's a towered method, and the positive we're seeing is there's kind of a shift away. There's still towers, don't get me wrong, but now we're going more to a participation and percentage portion. So there may be 13 syndicates, and all of them is responsible for a percentage. Obviously, I think Lloyd's and a lot of the syndicates are sick of this problem. So we're starting to see a shift where they're using a lead syndicate, and that lead is kind of, hey, if I sign off on this, you guys all agree to fall in line. So we're seeing some reprieve. Obviously, you guys, I know it feels like it takes ages for things to move, and maybe that's another good point to bring up is you have to understand, like, they've got to get out of that policy period, get a renewal, and then have a claim. You could be years before you actually see, that change take effect. It doesn't help you in the interim. But obviously in the interim, the biggest thing is understanding what kind of policy that is there, and then clearly communicating with the adjuster that's involved of, okay, hey, using your case in point, maybe that went up 4 tiers. Okay, well, I need a representative here from all 4 tiers, and getting a sign off on this is how we're going to do it, and what we're going to provide you. Is there any documentation that you need outside of that? Because, I can tell you multiple examples of the exact same situation. In fact, I was talking with a contractor a couple of weeks ago. He was telling me a story where he had a project, the same exact issue. They get in, get it done. And the insane thing about this one is it was 18 months after the project's completed.
Wow.
They had already been paid, but the insured had not been reimbursed. And they wanted them to go back, and they had all agreed to do it cost plus on this project. They want them to go back and provide, material and square footage pricing for all the work that had been done. And this is 18 months after the project.
Sounds like FEMA.
Yeah, exactly. But, understanding what it needs to be done, the one thing that I love about the Helix Co software is, and I'll give you a plug, is you can't mess up. The only thing you can mess up on is not submitting enough photos, but outside of that, as far as production goes, everything's going to get captured and be time stamped and documented. And it can be as summary or as detailed as somebody that wants to audit needs to have access to it. But the other cool thing that I like about it is that, we can go, and this is where I think a lot of contractors, I don't want to say fail. It's just they don't get told what bucket it needs to go into and how it needs to be done on the front side. You brought up FEMA. If we have a flood loss and a wind loss, and it's a condo association, so we've got a master policy, but then we've got individual unit owners, that gets complicated really, really, really quick. And then the biggest contractor fear is, okay, well, if I'm going to get audited, I don't want to double dip on general conditions, but I need general conditions. The ability within the software to apportion stuff, to be able to segment it. We've done it on multiple projects. This is, the code section. This is the business personal property. This is the, the master policy. Here's all the individual unit owners, where all that time and stuff is tracked and apportioned to what coverage. And it's not just what coverage, it may be what claim, because you could have multiple carriers involved on the same project. But that's the other thing that I just think is a lot of contractors are really good at what they do. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they're incredible at going in and knocking a project out. But if you want to get paid on it, how do you put it in the right bucket, wrap that bucket with wrapping paper and put a pretty little bow on it is where they struggle. And so that's where I think, finding the right technology and the right tools and, again, back to that first domino, how are we going to approach this project so that all goes in the right?
Yeah, I was going to kind of throw a little warning out there that, I had to learn many years ago that you walk onto a property and you're dealing with the client, and the client tells you, we have a single policy. Now, I would be like, for all the buildings, yep, single policy. So I would track the entire job on a single job, single T&M file. And then next thing you know, the adjuster show up was like, no, here's the asset chart. Every single building has its own coverage limits based on the value and estimated covered cost. And it's like, gee, so now I got to try to go back and try to back everything out. So I would always assume after I had that happen to me a couple of times, from that point on, I always assumed that every building was separate. And so I would try to track everything separate photos. Time is hard to do, especially during a catastrophic thing. And so you can allot that, based on a percentage value, to each building based on the amount of equipment and labor and things like that it took inside of it. And if you'll work with the consultants and adjusters, they'll help you with that, help you break your labor up, because it is almost impossible to have guys that are on the ground and you say you're doing a resort, or you're doing a hotel that has like multiple towers on site, condos, you cannot clock in and out every time you walk out of a condo door. I mean, you'll spend more time clocking in and out than you are getting work done. And so it's one of those things where you got to come in and try to allocate, and spread it across all the units. And then you still end up with unhappy people, because you'll get these condo associations like, well, Joe over here said he only had a bathroom wet and he's having to cover all this, labor and mobilization stuff. It's like, yeah, y'all in the same building. Y'all going to have to figure that out.
Yeah, but I think that does bring up a good point of, really on the front side, back to the stuff like that I would expect to hash out, using that example you gave. Okay, well, what are we going to dedicate? Like, is our demo and our people that are setting and monitoring equipment, can we dedicate those per building? And then who's going to be a floater? Identifying, okay, our project manager, our safety guy, these are the 6 people that are going to be floaters, but everything else we're going to track by building, and then go into the carrier and saying, hey, look, all these people are going to be tracked by building. These are the ones that are not. This is the method that we want to use to apportion based on a percentage. Are you fine with that?
Yeah.
Getting that done on the front is going to save you so much time and headache on the back. Because the next thing you know, if you wait, it's going to be, well, I need to see his time cards and I need to see his daily this, that, and the other. And,
All right, Brad. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Looking forward to next time. And tell everybody how they can find out more about Vector.
Yeah, so feel free to go to our website, vectorrisksolutions.com. And that being said, if I'm one of those, I'm an open book. I love helping. I mean, that's the other thing I like to tell a lot of people, especially a lot of times contractors feel threatened because we'll bring in another contractor. We're not, the first conversation I have is like, look, I'm not trying to bring this contractor in to steal this job. I'm trying to bring this contractor in to help you. And time again, we get thanked. Oh my God, I'm so glad you connected me with this person because they helped me do this more efficiently. Or, they turned me on to the Helix Co software.
Yeah.
It's our goal is to make you succeed, as a contractor, to make the insured happy with the overall, process and project, and the carrier to get what they need to get everybody paid. And the one thing that I preach, and I can't do this podcast without not saying it, is, pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered.
Yep.
It was something I can't take credit for. Somebody told me that years ago, but that's the biggest thing that we have to remember on these projects. You want to do 10 $10 million projects in a year, or do one $20 million and try to get it to 40, I made the extra 20 million off that project. Great. But guess what? You probably would have done 100 million this year if you'd done them all the right way. Do them the right way each and every time. And, understand that if it's my goal, and I know I'm just one person in this little, vast swimming sea, but, it's our goal to change how the relationship between, contractors and carriers. And we know it's an uphill long-term fight. I mean, obviously we're starting in the commercial, we're expanding quickly into very regional, state by state on some residential stuff. And long-term goal of getting into the cat stuff. But, honesty and integrity are, should be a foundation of who and what you do. And understanding that as a contractor will take you farther in life than it will, anything else that you do, because, getting our industry to the point to where you can walk in and say, this job's $100,000, and the carrier says, I agree, and here's your check. That's my goal. That should be for 9 out of 10 jobs. That's how quick and easy and smooth it should be. But again, back to what we've preached in here, it all goes back to the first domino and getting both sides to agree, and this is how it's going to go when the dominoes fall.
All right, Brad, I appreciate it. We'll definitely do this again. It's been fun, and I think it's going to be educational for a lot of guys to kind of get your point of view. So thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. Have a good one. We'll see you, Mike.
All right, bye.